a deep dive into one of history's most controversial theories. Introduction. A question that shakes the foundation of time. What if I told you that we might not be living in the year 2025? What if the calendar hanging on your wall is off by nearly 3 centuries? What if some of the most famous figures in medieval history never actually existed, and the timeline we've all been taught is nothing more than an elaborate fabrication? This isn't science fiction. This is the phantom time hypothesis, one of the most controversial theories ever proposed about our understanding of history. Tonight, we're going to explore a theory so audacious, so challenging to everything we think we know, that it has divided historians, archaeologists, and chronologists for decades. The man who dared to ask this question was German historian Herbert Illig. In 1991, he published a theory that would send shockwaves through the academic world. According to Illig, approximately 297 years of European history, specifically from 614 to 911 CE, never actually happened. These years, he claimed, were fabricated by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII as part of a massive conspiracy to place themselves at the significant year 1000 CE. If this sounds impossible, consider this. How do we actually know what year it is? We trust calendars, historical records, and the continuous counting of years. But what if that counting was deliberately manipulated? What if the very foundation of our chronological understanding has been built on a carefully constructed lie? As we journey through this mystery tonight, we'll examine the evidence that supports this theory, the fierce opposition it has faced, and the implications it would have for everything we understand about medieval history, the Catholic Church, and the nature of historical truth itself. Chapter 1. The man who dared to question time. To understand the phantom time hypothesis, we must first understand the man who proposed it. Herbert Illig wasn't some fringe conspiracy theorist writing from his basement. He was a respected German systems analyst and historian with a background in medieval studies. Born in 1947, Illig had spent years studying historical chronology, the science of arranging events in their order of occurrence in time. It was during his research into medieval history that Illig began to notice something troubling. The period between 600 and 1000 CE seemed remarkably sparse in terms of technological advancement, cultural development, and even basic historical documentation. While other periods of history showed clear progression and rich documentation, these 3 centuries appeared to be a historical void. Illig's background in systems analysis had trained him to look for patterns, inconsistencies, and logical flaws. As he examined the medieval period with this analytical eye, he began to see what he believed were signs of historical fabrication. The evidence seemed to point to a startling conclusion. These centuries hadn't been poorly documented because they were dark ages, but because they had never happened at all. The theory wasn't born overnight. Illig spent years developing his hypothesis, collaborating with other researchers including physicist Dr. Gunnar Heinsohn. Together, they began to examine archaeological evidence, astronomical records, and historical documents, looking for proof that the medieval chronology had been artificially extended. What they found, according to Illig, was a systematic lack of evidence for the supposed 297 years. Archaeological layers that should represent centuries of gradual development instead showed sudden jumps, carbon dating results that seemed inconsistent with traditional chronology, astronomical events that didn't align with recorded dates, and most damning of all, historical figures and events that seemed to be copied from earlier periods, simply given new names and dates. Illig's theory wasn't just academic speculation. He was making a serious accusation that medieval authorities had deliberately falsified the historical record for political and religious purposes. This wasn't just a mistake in counting years, it was an alleged conspiracy that had fooled historians for over 1,000 years. When Illig first published his theory in German academic journals, the response was swift and largely hostile. Mainstream historians dismissed his ideas as pseudo-history, but Illig persisted, refining his arguments and gathering more evidence. He founded a journal called Zeitenspring, Time Leaps, dedicated to exploring chronological anomalies in history. The theory gained international attention when it was translated into English and other languages. Suddenly, researchers around the world were examining medieval history with new eyes, looking for signs that Illig might be right. Some found his arguments compelling. Others found them dangerous to the integrity of historical scholarship. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Illig's theory wasn't the claim itself, but what it implied about the nature of historical knowledge. If 297 years could be fabricated and accepted as fact for a millennium, what else about our understanding of the past might be wrong? How much of history is based on reliable evidence, and how much on the authority of those who came before us? Chapter 2. The Case for Missing Years. To understand why Illig believed these years were fabricated, we need to examine his evidence. The phantom time hypothesis wasn't based on a single smoking gun, but rather on an accumulation of anomalies that Illig argued could only be explained by historical fabrication. Archaeological silence. One of Illig's strongest arguments concerned archaeology. In a properly functioning chronology, archaeological evidence should show gradual development over time. Pottery styles should evolve slowly. Building techniques should improve incrementally. Tool technology should advance step by step. But according to Illig, the archaeological record of early medieval Europe showed something very different. Instead of gradual development, Illig claimed to see sudden jumps. Carolingian artifacts seemed to appear abruptly, without the gradual development that should precede them. The material culture of the 7th century looked remarkably similar to that of the 10th century, as if very little time had actually passed between them. Illig pointed to specific examples across Europe. In Germany, archaeological sites showed what he described as chronological compression. Layers that should represent centuries of development instead showed rapid transitions. In France, the gap between Merovingian and Carolingian material culture seemed too abrupt to represent natural historical development. This archaeological evidence wasn't disputed by mainstream historians, but they interpreted it differently. Where Illig saw proof of fabricated centuries, traditional historians saw the results of political upheaval, economic collapse, and cultural transformation that characterized the early medieval period. The Carolingian mirage. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of Illig's theory concerned Charlemagne, one of the most famous figures in medieval history. According to traditional chronology, Charlemagne ruled from 768 to 814 CE and was crowned Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day, 800 CE. He is credited with unifying much of Western Europe and spurring the Carolingian Renaissance. Illig argued that Charlemagne was a fictional character created to fill the gap in the fabricated chronology. The evidence for Charlemagne's existence, Illig claimed, was largely based on documents created centuries after his supposed death. Contemporary evidence was sparse and suspicious. Moreover, Illig pointed to similarities between Charlemagne's supposed achievements and those of earlier and later rulers. The Carolingian Renaissance showed remarkable similarities to both the late Roman cultural revival and the later Ottonian Renaissance. It was as if the same historical pattern had been copied and inserted into different time periods. The palace school of Charlemagne, supposedly a center of learning and cultural development, left remarkably little tangible evidence for such an important institution. The manuscripts attributed to Carolingian scholars showed suspicious similarities to both earlier and later works. Even Charlemagne's famous capitularies, his legal and administrative decrees, seemed to show knowledge of legal developments that hadn't yet occurred according to traditional chronology. Astronomical anomalies. One of the most technical aspects of Illig's argument involved astronomy. Historical chronicles often recorded celestial events, eclipses, comets, and unusual stellar phenomena. These events can be calculated backward with great precision, providing an independent check on historical dates. When Illig and his colleagues examined astronomical records from the Phantom period, they found troubling inconsistencies. Solar eclipses that should have been visible from Europe, according to traditional dating, were recorded as occurring in the wrong locations or at impossible times. Lunar eclipses, described in chronicles, didn't match what should have been visible according to astronomical calculations. One particular example that Illig highlighted was a solar eclipse reportedly observed in 810 CE. When astronomers calculated backward to determine what eclipse this might have been, they found that no solar eclipse visible from Europe occurred in that year. The closest matches were eclipses that occurred in the 6th or 11th centuries. Comet sightings presented similar problems. Halley's Comet, which follows a predictable 76-year orbit, was reportedly seen in 837 CE, according to medieval chronicles. But when astronomers traced the comet's orbit backward, they found discrepancies that suggested the dating was incorrect. These astronomical anomalies weren't proof in themselves. Ancient chroniclers could have made errors in observation or recording, but Illig argued that the pattern of inconsistencies was too systematic to be explained by simple mistakes. The calendar problem. Another piece of evidence that Illig found compelling concerned calendar reform. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII reformed the Julian calendar to create our modern Gregorian calendar. The reform was necessary because the Julian calendar was running slow, causing the spring equinox to drift earlier each year. By the 16th century, the spring equinox was occurring on March 11th instead of March 21st, a drift of 10 days. The Gregorian reform corrected this by skipping 10 days. October 4th, 1582 was followed by October 15th, 1582. Illig argued that this drift was smaller than it should have been. If the Julian calendar had been in use since Julius Caesar's time, 45 BCE, the drift should have been approximately 13 days by 1582, not 10. The missing 3 days, Illig claimed, represented the Phantom period, time that was counted but never actually existed. This argument was technically complex and involved detailed calculations about the rate of calendar drift. Critics pointed out that the calculations were more complicated than Illig suggested, involving factors like leap year rules and varying definitions of the tropical year. But for Illig's supporters, the calendar drift remained compelling evidence that the medieval chronology had been artificially extended. Chapter 3. The Alleged Conspirators. According to Illig's theory, the fabrication of phantom time wasn't an accident or the result of gradual historical confusion. It was a deliberate conspiracy orchestrated by some of the most powerful figures of the 10th century. But why would anyone want to create fake centuries of history? And how could they have pulled off such a massive deception? Otto III, the boy emperor with grand ambitions. Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor, from 996 to 1002, was, according to Illig, one of the primary architects of the phantom time conspiracy. Otto was crowned emperor at the age of just 16, and despite his youth, he harbored grandiose ambitions for his reign. He dreamed of creating a renovation of the Roman Empire that would rival the achievements of ancient Rome. According to traditional chronology, Otto's reign began in the late 10th century, approaching the year 1000 CE, a date with enormous symbolic significance in medieval Christian thought. The year 1000 was associated with apocalyptic prophecies and the potential second coming of Christ. It was also seen as a symbolic milestone, a time when great changes might occur in the Christian world. Illig argued that Otto, obsessed with the symbolic power of ruling at the millennium, conspired to move the calendar forward so that his reign would coincide with the year 1000. By fabricating approximately 297 years of history, Otto could place himself at this crucial moment in Christian chronology, lending divine significance to his rule. Otto's court was filled with learned scholars, many of whom had access to historical documents and calendrical knowledge. If anyone had the resources and expertise to fabricate centuries of history, it would have been Otto's advisors, They could create false documents, backdated chronicles, and even fake genealogies to support their fabricated chronology. The political benefits of this conspiracy would have been enormous. By claiming to rule at the dawn of a new millennium, Otto could position himself as a ruler of cosmic significance. His political rivals would be forced to acknowledge his special status. Then the Church would see divine providence in his reign. Pope Sylvester II, the scholar pope, working alongside Otto III, according to Illig, was Pope Sylvester II, one of the most learned men of his age. Born Gerbert of Aurillac, Sylvester was renowned for his knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and classical literature. He had studied in Islamic Spain and brought Arabic knowledge to Christian Europe. If anyone had the technical expertise to fabricate a convincing historical chronology, it would have been Sylvester. Sylvester's relationship with Otto III was unusually close for an emperor and pope. They shared a vision of renewing the Roman Empire and establishing a new golden age of Christian learning. This partnership, Illig argued, would have been essential for carrying out the phantom time conspiracy. As Pope Sylvester had access to the Church's vast archives of historical documents, he could authorize the creation of new documents, the modification of existing ones, and the destruction of materials that contradicted the fabricated chronology. Monasteries across Europe, which served as centers of learning and document preservation, would have followed papal directives about historical records. Sylvester's scholarly reputation gave legitimacy to the conspiracy. When learned monks and chroniclers received ancient documents bearing his approval, they would have had little reason to question their authenticity. The Pope's word carried enormous authority in matters of historical truth. Constantine VII. The Byzantine connection. The third major conspirator, according to Illig, was Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, Byzantine emperor from 913 to 959. Constantine was known for his patronage of learning and his efforts to preserve and systematize historical knowledge. His court produced numerous historical works, including detailed chronicles of Byzantine history. But why would a Byzantine emperor participate in a conspiracy organized by Western European rulers? Illig argued that Constantine had his own motivations for supporting the phantom time fabrication. By aligning Byzantine chronology with the fabricated Western timeline, Constantine could ensure that his empire maintained synchronized diplomatic and trade relationships with Western Europe. Moreover, the phantom time conspiracy would have allowed Constantine to claim a longer and more illustrious lineage for his dynasty. By stretching Byzantine history backward, he could enhance the legitimacy of his rule and compete with Western claims of imperial succession from Rome. The Byzantine Empire had sophisticated scholarly institutions and well-preserved archives. If Constantine ordered his historians to support the fabricated chronology, they would have had the resources to create convincing historical documents. Byzantine scholars could produce Greek texts that supported the Western fabrication, lending international credibility to the conspiracy. How the conspiracy would have worked according to Illig's theory. The phantom time conspiracy would have required careful coordination across Europe. The conspirators would have needed to create false documents, fabricate chronicles, royal genealogies, papal bulls and other historical records to support the extended chronology, modify existing records, alter genuine historical documents to include references to the phantom period, creating an appearance of continuity, establish false dating systems, convince scribes and chroniclers across Europe to use the fabricated chronology in their dating of contemporary events, suppress contradictory evidence, destroy or hide documents that revealed the true chronology, ensuring that future historians would only have access to materials supporting the fabrication, create false genealogies, invent royal lineages and papal successions to fill the phantom period, giving the appearance of continuous political development. The success of this conspiracy would have depended on the limited literacy and communication of the medieval period. Most people couldn't read and had no independent access to historical documents. They would have accepted whatever chronology was provided by church and royal authorities. Chapter 4. the evidence examined. While Illig's theory is fascinating, it's crucial to examine the evidence critically. Mainstream historians have raised numerous objections to the phantom time hypothesis, pointing to evidence that they argue definitively proves the existence of the supposedly phantom years. Archaeological counter-evidence. Professional archaeologists have been among the harshest critics of Illig's theory. They point to thousands of archaeological sites across Europe that show clear stratification and development through the supposedly phantom period. Carbon-14 dating, when properly calibrated, consistently places artifacts and organic materials from the early medieval period within the traditional chronological framework. While carbon dating has margins of error, the consistency of results across multiple sites and multiple dating methods makes it extremely unlikely that the entire period is fabricated. Dendrochronology, the study of tree ring patterns, provides another independent check on medieval chronology. Tree ring sequences from medieval Europe show continuous growth patterns that align with traditional dating. Since tree rings form annually and create unique patterns based on climate conditions, they provide a year-by-year record that's difficult to fabricate. Pottery sequences show gradual stylistic development through the early medieval period. While Illig argued that these changes were too abrupt, professional archaeologists see clear evolutionary patterns in ceramic technology and decoration that span the supposedly phantom centuries. Documentary evidence. Medieval historians point to thousands of documents from the supposedly phantom period. These include not just formal chronicles, but also charters, property deeds, legal documents, letters, and administrative records. Many of these documents reference each other, creating complex webs of historical connection that would be nearly impossible to fabricate consistently. The Carolingian, minuscule, a distinctive style of writing that developed during Charlemagne's reign, shows clear evolution from earlier scripts and influenced later medieval handwriting. This gradual development of writing styles provides independent evidence for the traditional chronology. Many documents from the Phantom period were copied by scribes who lived during supposedly genuine periods. These scribes often added their own notes and commentary, providing evidence that they believed they were copying authentic historical materials. International synchronization. One of the strongest arguments against the phantom time theory involves synchronization with non-European chronologies. The Islamic world, Byzantine Empire, China, and other civilizations maintained their own historical records during the supposedly phantom period. These independent chronologies align with traditional European dating, making a localized European conspiracy extremely unlikely. Arabic historians recorded interactions with Carolingian rulers, who are supposedly fictional, according to Illig's theory. Chinese astronomical records from the Tang dynasty align with European dates for celestial events. The level of international coordination required to fabricate all these independent records would have been impossible in the medieval period. Astronomical rebuttal. Professional astronomers have examined Illig's claims about astronomical anomalies and found them unconvincing. The supposed discrepancies in eclipse and comet records can usually be explained by errors in medieval observation and recording rather than chronological fabrication. Medieval chroniclers often copied astronomical information from earlier sources rather than making direct observations. They might record an eclipse as occurring in their own time when they were actually copying a description from a much earlier chronicle. This explains many of the astronomical inconsistencies that Illig identified. Modern calculations of historical astronomical events must account for changes in Earth's rotation rate, precession of the equinoxes, and other factors that make exact dating challenging. When these factors are properly considered, most medieval astronomical records align reasonably well with calculated dates. The calendar calculation problem. Historians and astronomers have also challenged Illig's argument about calendar drift. The calculation of Julian calendar drift is more complex than Illig suggested, involving factors like variations in the length of the tropical year, changes in Earth's rotation rate over time, different definitions of when the spring equinox should occur, irregular application of leap year rules. When these factors are properly considered, The 10-day correction in 1582 is consistent with the Julian calendar, having been in use since Caesar's time. The supposed missing 3 days can be accounted for by these complex chronological factors. Chapter 5. The Church's Role in Medieval Chronology. Whether or not the phantom time hypothesis is correct, it raises important questions about the Catholic Church's role in preserving and transmitting historical knowledge during the medieval period. The Church wasn't just a religious institution, it was the primary keeper of European learning and historical memory. Monastic scriptoriums and historical records. Medieval monasteries served as the libraries and archives of their age. Monks spent countless hours copying manuscripts, preserving both religious and secular texts. The scriptoriums of major monasteries like Monte Cassino, Saint Denis, and Fulda were centers of historical scholarship. But this system of preservation wasn't neutral. Monks decided which texts were worth copying and which should be allowed to fade into oblivion. They often modified texts as they copied them, correcting what they saw as errors or adding explanatory notes. Over time, these modifications could significantly alter the meaning of historical texts. The Church also controlled the training of scribes and scholars. The educational curriculum in medieval Europe was dominated by religious institutions. This meant that the people who could read, write, and interpret historical documents were trained within a system that valued church authority and orthodox Christian interpretation of events. Papal control of dating systems. The Catholic Church played a crucial role in establishing medieval dating systems. The most important of these was the Anno Domini AD system, which dated events from the supposed birth of Christ. This system was created by the monk Dionysius Exiguus in the 6th century and gradually adopted across Christian Europe. But the AD system wasn't implemented uniformly or immediately. Different regions and institutions used different dating methods for centuries. Some used regnal years, dating from the beginning of a ruler's reign. Others used indictions, 15-year cycles, and still others used various local era systems. This diversity in dating systems created opportunities for confusion and manipulation. A document dated in the 5th year of King X could be assigned different absolute dates depending on when historians believed King X ruled. If royal chronologies were artificially extended, all documents dated by regnal years would be misdated accordingly. The Church gradually standardized European chronology around the AD system, but this process took centuries and involved numerous judgment calls about how to align different dating systems. These decisions were made by church authorities who had their own political and religious motivations. The question of intentional falsification. Mainstream historians generally reject the idea that the medieval church intentionally falsified historical records on the scale suggested by the phantom time hypothesis. They point out that medieval chroniclers, despite their biases, made serious efforts to preserve historical truth as they understood it. However, this doesn't mean that church authorities never manipulated historical records for political purposes. There are well-documented cases of medieval forgeries, including the donation of Constantine, a forged document that supposedly granted the Pope temporal authority over Western Europe, false capitularies attributed to Charlemagne to support later papal claims, fabricated genealogies linking medieval dynasties to biblical or classical figures, backdated papal bulls used to support territorial claims. While these forgeries were significant, they typically involved specific political claims rather than wholesale fabrication of chronology. The scale of deception required for the phantom time hypothesis would have been unprecedented in medieval Europe. The preservation problem. One of the strongest arguments in favor of the traditional medieval chronology is the sheer volume of surviving documentation. Medieval Europe wasn't as literate as the modern world, but it still produced enormous quantities of written material. Thousands of documents survive from the supposedly phantom period, including royal charters and diplomas, papal bulls, and letters, monastic records and cartularies, legal codes and court records, literary works and biblical commentaries, administrative documents and tax records. Creating this volume of fabricated material would have required a massive effort involving hundreds of scribes working over many years. The conspiracy would have needed to maintain consistency across all these different types of documents, creating cross-references and maintaining plausible historical connections. Moreover, many of these documents were preserved in different archives across Europe. The fabrication would have required coordination between monasteries, royal courts, and episcopal sees across the continent, a level of organization that seems implausible for the 10th century. Chapter 6. Alternative Theories and Interpretations. While the mainstream historical community has largely rejected Illig's phantom time hypothesis, the questions he raised have inspired other researchers to examine medieval chronology with fresh eyes. Some have proposed alternative theories that might explain the anomalies Illig identified without requiring the wholesale fabrication of centuries. Chronological compression theory. Some historians have suggested that while the phantom years did exist, they may have been compressed in terms of cultural and technological development, political instability, economic collapse, and population decline during the early medieval period could have slowed the pace of change, creating an appearance of historical stagnation. This Dark Age interpretation suggests that the early medieval period was indeed a time of reduced cultural activity compared to earlier and later periods. The relative scarcity of archaeological evidence and documentary sources might reflect real historical conditions rather than chronological fabrication. Under this interpretation, Charlemagne and other supposedly fictional figures were real historical people, but their achievements may have been exaggerated by later chroniclers who wanted to create a sense of continuity with the classical past. The Carolingian Renaissance might have been more modest than traditional accounts suggest. Regional variation theory. Another alternative explanation focuses on regional variations in medieval development. While some areas of Europe may have experienced genuine cultural and economic decline during the early medieval period, others might have maintained higher levels of activity. This theory suggests that historians have been too quick to generalize from limited evidence. Archaeological silence in one region doesn't necessarily mean that nothing was happening anywhere in Europe. The apparent gaps in the historical record might reflect the geographic biases of surviving sources rather than wholesale historical fabrication. Document loss and survival bias. A third alternative focuses on the survival of historical documents. The medieval period saw numerous disasters that could have destroyed large numbers of historical records. Viking raids, Magyar invasions, civil wars, fires, and other catastrophes. This document loss theory suggests that the apparent scarcity of early medieval sources reflects the hazards of preservation rather than the absence of original documents. Later medieval scholars may have done their best to reconstruct missing chronologies from fragmentary evidence, occasionally making errors that created apparent anomalies. Modified phantom time theories. Some researchers have proposed modifications to Illig's original theory that might make it more plausible. Shorter phantom period. Instead of 297 years, perhaps only a few decades were fabricated to address specific chronological problems. Partial fabrication. Maybe some figures like Charlemagne were real, but their chronologies were artificially extended to fill gaps in the historical record. Gradual development. Rather than a single conspiracy, perhaps chronological errors accumulated over time as medieval scribes tried to reconcile conflicting dating systems. Regional fabrication. The phantom time might apply only to certain regions or ruling dynasties, rather than all of medieval Europe. These modified theories attempt to address some of the strongest objections to Illig's original hypothesis while still acknowledging the chronological anomalies he identified. Chapter 7. The Implications of Phantom Time. Whether or not the phantom time hypothesis is correct, it raises profound questions about the nature of historical knowledge and the reliability of our understanding of the past. If Illig is right, the implications would extend far beyond medieval studies. The nature of historical truth. The phantom time debate highlights fundamental questions about how we know what we know about the past. Historical knowledge is based on evidence, but that evidence must be interpreted by historians who bring their own assumptions and biases to their work. If centuries of history could be fabricated and accepted as truth for over a millennium, what does this say about the reliability of historical scholarship? How can we distinguish between genuine historical evidence and convincing fabrications? These questions become particularly important when we consider that most historical evidence consists of documents written by people with their own political and religious agendas. Medieval chroniclers weren't neutral observers. They were often writing to support particular rulers or religious institutions. Authority and orthodoxy in historical studies. The hostile reception that Illig's theory received from mainstream historians also raises questions about authority and orthodoxy in academic disciplines. Historical scholarship, like any academic field, has established methods, accepted interpretations, and institutional hierarchies. When an outsider challenges fundamental assumptions of the field, the response often involves defending established orthodoxy rather than objectively examining new evidence. This tendency toward intellectual conservatism might prevent the recognition of genuine errors in historical understanding. On the other hand, the standards of evidence in historical scholarship exist for good reasons. Wild theories without solid evidence can undermine public confidence in historical knowledge and provide fodder for political manipulation of the past. The medieval church and historical manipulation, even if the phantom time hypothesis is false, it draws attention to the very real ways that medieval institutions shaped historical understanding. The Catholic Church wasn't just preserving historical knowledge, it was actively interpreting and sometimes modifying it to serve contemporary needs. This process of historical interpretation and modification continues today. Every generation reinterprets the past in light of contemporary concerns and values. The difference is that modern historians generally acknowledge this interpretive process, while medieval chroniclers often presented their interpretations as objective fact. Chronological systems and cultural power. The phantom time debate also highlights the political dimensions of chronological systems. Calendars aren't just practical tools for organizing time, they're expressions of cultural and religious authority. The dominance of the Christian ADC system in Western chronology reflects the historical power of Christianity, rather than any inherent superiority of this dating method. Other cultures have developed different chronological systems based on their own religious and cultural priorities. If the phantom time hypothesis were correct, it would demonstrate how chronological systems can be manipulated to serve political purposes. Even if it's false, it reminds us that our dating systems aren't neutral scientific instruments, but cultural constructions with political implications. Chapter 8. Modern Investigations and Digital Analysis. In recent years, researchers have used modern technology to investigate claims related to the phantom time hypothesis. Digital analysis tools, database searches, and statistical methods have provided new ways to examine medieval chronology. Digital manuscript analysis scholars have created digital databases of medieval manuscripts that allow for comprehensive analysis of writing styles, paper types, and ink composition. These databases can track the evolution of manuscript production techniques over time and identify anachronisms that might suggest forgery. When applied to supposedly phantom period documents, these analyses generally support traditional dating. The gradual evolution of writing styles, manuscript decoration, and production techniques shows continuity through the early medieval period rather than sudden jumps that might indicate fabrication. Statistical analysis of historical records. Researchers have also applied statistical methods to analyze patterns in medieval historical records. By examining the frequency of certain words, names, and concepts across different time periods, they can identify unusual patterns that might suggest fabrication. These statistical analyses have generally found patterns consistent with authentic historical development rather than wholesale fabrication. The vocabulary and concerns of early medieval documents show gradual evolution that would be difficult to fabricate convincingly. Archaeological database integration. Modern archaeological databases allow researchers to examine material culture patterns across wide geographical and chronological ranges. These databases can identify unusual gaps or anomalies in the archaeological record that might support chronological revision. While some regional variations and preservation biases exist, the overall pattern of archaeological evidence supports continuous development through the early medieval period. The integration of archaeological data from across Europe shows consistent patterns that would be nearly impossible to fabricate. Astronomical verification software. Advanced astronomical software now allows researchers to calculate historical celestial events with unprecedented precision. These calculations can verify or refute claims about astronomical anomalies in medieval records. When medieval astronomical records are examined using modern software, most apparent discrepancies can be explained by observation errors, transcription mistakes, or the copying of information from earlier sources. The pattern of errors is consistent with authentic medieval attempts to record celestial events rather than systematic fabrication. Chapter 9. The persistence of alternative chronologies. Despite the widespread rejection of the phantom time hypothesis by mainstream historians, alternative chronological theories continue to attract interest from both researchers and the general public. This persistence raises questions about why such theories remain appealing even when they lack strong evidence. The appeal of hidden truth conspiracy theories often appeal to people because they offer a sense of special knowledge, the feeling that one understands hidden truths that others miss. The phantom time hypothesis provides this appeal by suggesting that everyone else has been fooled by a massive historical deception. This psychological appeal doesn't necessarily make the theory false, but it helps explain why alternative chronological theories persist even when evidence against them accumulates. The emotional satisfaction of believing in hidden knowledge can be powerful enough to overcome contrary evidence. Skepticism toward authority. The persistence of the phantom time hypothesis also reflects broader cultural skepticism toward established authorities, including academic institutions. Many people are suspicious of claims that require them to trust experts and prefer theories that allow them to question orthodox interpretations. This skepticism has both positive and negative aspects. Healthy skepticism can prevent the acceptance of false claims and encourage critical thinking, but excessive skepticism can lead to the rejection of well-supported scientific and historical conclusions. The complexity of historical evidence. Historical evidence is often complex and ambiguous, requiring specialized knowledge to interpret properly. The phantom time hypothesis exploits this complexity by pointing to apparent anomalies that seem significant to non-specialists, but have straightforward explanations for professional historians. The gap between specialist knowledge and public understanding creates opportunities for alternative theories that sound plausible to general audiences, but lack support from experts in the field. Digital age information dynamics. The internet has changed how alternative historical theories spread and persist. Online communities can form around shared belief in particular theories, reinforcing each other's conviction and developing increasingly sophisticated arguments to defend their positions. These digital echo chambers can insulate alternative theory supporters from contrary evidence and criticism. They can also create the impression that there is more scientific support for alternative theories than actually exists. Chapter 10. Lessons for historical understanding. Whether we accept or reject the phantom time hypothesis, it offers important lessons about how we understand and study history. These lessons extend beyond medieval chronology to broader questions about historical methodology and the nature of knowledge about the past. The importance of multiple lines of evidence. The phantom time debate demonstrates the importance of using multiple independent lines of evidence when investigating historical questions. No single type of evidence, whether documentary, archaeological, or astronomical, is sufficient by itself to establish historical truth. The strength of the traditional medieval chronology lies not in any single piece of evidence, but in the convergence of multiple independent sources of information, documents, artifacts, natural records, and foreign accounts all support the same basic timeline. This principle applies beyond medieval studies to all areas of historical research. The most reliable historical conclusions are those supported by diverse types of evidence from multiple independent sources. The role of expertise in historical interpretation. The phantom time controversy also highlights the importance of specialized expertise in interpreting historical evidence. Many of the apparent anomalies that Illig identified have straightforward explanations that require detailed knowledge of medieval history, archaeology, or astronomy. This doesn't mean that experts are always right, or that alternative interpretations should be dismissed without consideration. but it does suggest that extraordinary claims about historical events require extraordinary evidence and should be evaluated by people with relevant expertise. The provisional nature of historical knowledge. All historical knowledge is provisional, subject to revision, based on new evidence or better interpretation of existing evidence. The possibility that our understanding of medieval chronology could be fundamentally wrong, while unlikely, reminds us that historical conclusions should always remain open to challenge. This provisional quality doesn't make historical knowledge unreliable or meaningless. Instead, it reflects the self-correcting nature of scholarly inquiry. Historical understanding improves over time as new evidence is discovered and analytical methods are refined. The politics of historical interpretation. The phantom time debate also illustrates how political and cultural factors can influence historical interpretation. Both the original medieval chroniclers and modern historians bring their own biases and agendas to their work. Recognizing these political dimensions doesn't mean that all historical interpretations are equally valid or that objective historical truth is impossible to achieve, but it does mean that historical claims should be evaluated critically, with attention to the motivations and biases of those making them. Chapter 11. The Search for Truth in Historical Mysteries. As we approach the end of our exploration of the phantom time hypothesis, it's worth reflecting on what this controversy teaches us about the nature of historical inquiry and the challenges of understanding our past. The value of asking difficult questions. Regardless of whether Illig's theory is correct, his willingness to question fundamental assumptions about medieval chronology has value. Science and scholarship advance through the testing of established ideas, even when that testing proves the original ideas were correct. Illig's hypothesis has forced medieval historians to examine their evidence more carefully, to consider alternative explanations for chronological anomalies, and to think more critically about the processes by which historical knowledge is created and transmitted. This kind of intellectual challenge is healthy for any academic discipline. It prevents scholars from becoming complacent about their conclusions and encourages them to remain open to new evidence and interpretations. The challenge of extraordinary claims. At the same time, the phantom time hypothesis illustrates the importance of maintaining appropriate standards of evidence when evaluating extraordinary claims. The assertion that nearly 3 centuries of history are fabricated requires extraordinary evidence to support it. While Illig has identified some genuine anomalies in medieval chronology, the weight of evidence from multiple independent sources strongly supports the traditional dating of the early medieval period. Archaeological, documentary, astronomical, and comparative evidence all point in the same direction. The scientific principle of parsimony, choosing the simplest explanation that accounts for all available evidence, favors the traditional chronology over the phantom time theory. While medieval chronology isn't perfect, it doesn't require the assumption of a massive conspiracy to explain the available evidence. The continuing mystery of the early medieval period. Even if we reject the phantom time hypothesis, questions remain about the early medieval period in Europe. This was indeed a time of significant cultural and economic change, marked by the collapse of Roman administrative structures and the gradual emergence of new political and social systems. The relative scarcity of written sources from this period, the apparent gaps in archaeological sequences, and the undeniable biases of surviving chronicles all create legitimate challenges for historians trying to understand what happened during these centuries. Future research may reveal new evidence that requires us to revise our understanding of early medieval chronology. New archaeological discoveries, improved dating techniques, or better analysis of existing sources could all contribute to a more accurate picture of this period. The importance of historical literacy. The phantom time controversy also highlights the importance of historical literacy among the general public. Many people lack the background knowledge necessary to evaluate historical claims critically, making them vulnerable to convincing but inaccurate theories. Understanding how historians work, what kinds of evidence they use, and how historical knowledge is constructed can help people make better judgments about competing historical claims. This kind of critical thinking is valuable not just for understanding the past, but for navigating contemporary debates about politics, science, and culture. Chapter 12: The Legacy of the Phantom Time Debate. As we conclude our investigation of the phantom time hypothesis, it's important to consider its lasting impact on historical scholarship and popular understanding of the past. Academic reception and response. Within academic circles, the phantom time hypothesis has generally been dismissed as pseudo-history. Major historical journals have published few articles seriously engaging with Illig's claims, and medieval history textbooks rarely mention the theory, except as an example of how not to do historical research. However, the theory has had some positive effects on medieval scholarship. It has encouraged historians to be more explicit about their methodology, to provide better explanations for chronological anomalies, and to make their work more accessible to general audiences. Some scholars have used the phantom time controversy as a teaching tool, helping students understand the importance of evaluating sources critically and considering multiple types of evidence when making historical arguments. Popular culture and media. The phantom time hypothesis has found a much more receptive audience in popular culture than in academic circles. Books, websites, and documentaries promoting the theory continue to appear, often presenting it as a legitimate alternative to mainstream historical understanding. This popular reception reflects broader cultural trends, including skepticism toward expert authority, fascination with conspiracy theories, and the appeal of hidden knowledge. The theory offers a dramatic narrative that challenges conventional wisdom and suggests that ordinary people can see through the deceptions of scholarly elites. The internet has played a crucial role in spreading awareness of the phantom time theory. Online forums, social media, and video platforms have allowed supporters to share their ideas and recruit new believers, often without the filtering effects of peer review or expert evaluation. Educational implications. The phantom time controversy raises important questions about how history should be taught in schools and universities. Should alternative theories like Illig's be presented alongside mainstream interpretations, or would this confuse students and undermine their understanding of how historical knowledge is created? Most educators argue that students need a solid foundation in established historical knowledge before they can meaningfully evaluate alternative theories. Teaching phantom time theory alongside traditional medieval history might give students the false impression that all historical interpretations are equally valid. However, the controversy can be useful for teaching critical thinking skills. Students can learn to evaluate historical evidence, understand the difference between correlation and causation, and recognize the importance of multiple independent sources of information. The future of historical controversy. The phantom time hypothesis is unlikely to be the last alternative historical theory to challenge mainstream scholarship. As new technologies emerge and cultural attitudes change, other researchers will probably propose their own radical reinterpretations of the past. The historical community's response to these challenges will shape the future of the discipline. Too much resistance to new ideas can stifle legitimate innovation, while too much openness to unsupported speculation can undermine public confidence in historical knowledge. Finding the right balance requires maintaining high standards of evidence while remaining open to legitimate challenges to established interpretations. It also requires better communication between historians and the general public, helping people understand how historical knowledge is created and evaluated. Conclusion. Time, truth, and the human quest for understanding. As we reach the end of our journey through the phantom time hypothesis, we find ourselves confronting questions that extend far beyond medieval chronology. This theory, whether ultimately right or wrong, has forced us to examine some of the most fundamental assumptions about how we understand the past. What have we learned? Our investigation has revealed several important insights. Historical knowledge is complex and fragile. The process of preserving and transmitting information about the past involves countless decisions about what to record, what to preserve, and how to interpret ambiguous evidence. This process is vulnerable to error, bias, and even deliberate manipulation. Evidence must be evaluated holistically. No single piece of evidence, whether archaeological, documentary, or astronomical, can definitively prove or disprove a historical claim. The strength of historical conclusions comes from the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence. Expertise matters, but shouldn't be immune to challenge. Professional historians have specialized knowledge that allows them to interpret evidence more accurately than untrained individuals. However, this expertise can sometimes create blind spots or resistance to legitimate challenges to orthodox interpretations. The appeal of alternative theories reflects deeper cultural concerns. The popularity of the phantom time hypothesis among some members of the public reflects broader anxieties about authority, truth, and the reliability of expert knowledge in contemporary society. The enduring questions, despite our extensive examination of the evidence, some questions raised by the phantom time hypothesis remain genuinely difficult to answer. How can we be absolutely certain about the dating of events that occurred over 1,000 years ago? What biases might be built into our historical sources that we haven't recognized? How should historians balance openness to new interpretations with the need to maintain scholarly standards? What is the appropriate role of non-specialists in evaluating historical claims? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're worth asking. They remind us that historical knowledge, like all human knowledge, is provisional and subject to revision based on new evidence or better analytical methods. The value of the journey, whether or not you find Illig's theory convincing, the process of examining it has value. It has forced us to think more carefully about how we know what we know about the past. It has highlighted the importance of critical thinking and careful evaluation of evidence, and it has reminded us that the quest for historical truth is an ongoing process, not a finished product. The medieval period that Illig questioned was indeed a time of great change and uncertainty. The collapse of Roman institutions, the rise of Christianity, the emergence of new political systems, all of these developments shaped the world we inhabit today. Understanding this period accurately is important, not just for academic reasons, but because it helps us understand the origins of many contemporary institutions and ideas. The phantom time hypothesis and human nature. Perhaps most importantly, the phantom time controversy reveals something fundamental about human nature. We are meaning-making creatures, constantly trying to understand our place in the world and our relationship to the past. When the official stories we're told seem incomplete or unsatisfying, some of us are driven to seek alternative explanations. This drive toward inquiry and skepticism is valuable, even when it leads us down incorrect paths. The willingness to question established authority and seek hidden truths has led to many genuine discoveries throughout history. The challenge is learning to distinguish between legitimate inquiry and unfounded speculation. A final thought on time and memory. Time itself remains mysterious. We experience it as a flowing river, carrying us from past through present toward future. But time is also a human construct, measured by calendars and clocks that we have created to organize our experience of duration and sequence. The phantom time hypothesis reminds us that our relationship with historical time is more fragile than we might assume. The dates on our calendars, the timelines in our textbooks, the chronologies that structure our understanding of the past, all of these are human creations, subject to error and revision. This doesn't mean that historical time is arbitrary or that all chronologies are equally valid, but it does suggest that we should hold our confidence in specific dates and timelines lightly, remaining open to new evidence that might require us to revise our understanding. Moving forward, as we conclude this investigation, we're left not with definitive answers, but with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of historical inquiry and the challenges of understanding our past. The phantom time hypothesis, whether ultimately correct or incorrect, has served its purpose by forcing us to examine our assumptions and consider alternative possibilities. The truth about medieval chronology will ultimately be determined not by dramatic theories or conspiracy claims, but by the patient accumulation and careful analysis of evidence. This process will continue as long as humans are curious about their past and committed to understanding the world they inhabit. In the meantime, we can appreciate the mystery and uncertainty that surrounds much of human history. We can remain skeptical of claims that seem too neat or convenient, while also avoiding the trap of excessive cynicism that rejects all expert knowledge. And we can continue to ask questions, seek evidence, and remain open to the possibility that our understanding of the past might need to be revised. The phantom centuries of Heribert Illig may never have existed, but the questions they raised about truth, time, and historical knowledge will continue to challenge and inspire us for generations to come. In the end, perhaps that is the most valuable legacy of this controversial theory, not the specific claims it makes about medieval chronology, but the broader questions it raises about how we understand ourselves and our place in the long story of human civilization. Whether we're living in 2025 or 1725, whether Charlemagne was real or fictional, whether the Dark Ages happened as we think they did, these questions matter because they connect us to the deepest human need to understand where we come from and how we got here. And that quest for understanding, with all its uncertainties and controversies, may be the most genuinely human endeavor of all. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time, mystery, and the endless human quest to understand our past. Sweet dreams, and may your explorations of history continue to challenge and inspire you.